December 19, 1941. Snow falls over Moscow like a white curtain drawn across the city's wounds. The Kremlin stone facades are muffled. Lamplight glows through steam. From a high window, Joseph Stalin watches a column of unfamiliar machines move through the streets. An odd procession of rivets, thin armor, and American markings. They are not T-34s. They are not the heavy Soviet machines he expects. They are American, M3 Lees with their awkward high turrets and sponson guns, and smaller M3 Stuarts, their silhouettes almost comical against the winter light. The tracks crunch on the frozen boulevards. The engines exhale white puffs that mingle with the breath of the city. For the leader of a state built on self-reliance and proletarian pride, the sight is an admission rendered in steel and paint. Help has come from the capitalist world. What did that moment mean, politically, materially, personally, for Stalin and for a nation at war for its existence? Was it a lifeline, a humiliation, a pragmatic necessity, or all three at once? To answer that, we have to unspool the year that preceded it, follow the routes the supplies traveled, meet the men who inspected those tanks, and return to the Kremlin window to watch how a single image, foreign armor rolling through the capital, came to symbolize much more than the machines themselves. On June 22, 1941, the map changed. Operation Barbarossa struck at dawn. German boots, tanks, and dive bombers poured across the Soviet western borders. The Red Army, long the product of rapid but uneven industrialization and purges that had hollowed its officer corps, found itself exposed. Airfields were hit on the ground, convoys ambushed, whole formations encircled and destroyed. The speed of the German advance shattered command and control. For months, the Soviet Union would be on the defensive, bleeding men and materiel in a way that made the winter months ahead look life or death in the literal sense. Stalin's response was complicated. Publicly, he could call for resilience and counterattack. Privately, the Kremlin was a place of urgent, often grim bargaining. The scale of the crisis forced choices that ran against ideology and pride. In Washington, the question was different, but equally urgent. How to aid an ally whose political system American voters and politicians distrusted, while also keeping alive a front that tied down the German war machine and served the wider Allied cause. Franklin D. Roosevelt faced that dilemma and resolved, slowly and under pressure from his advisors and realists in London and Moscow, to make material assistance available. The mechanism for that choice was Lend-Lease, a policy that had proven its worth in supplying Britain and that Roosevelt argued could be extended. Political compromises were necessary. Neutral attitudes in the U.S. Congress, logistical limits, and domestic political calculation shaped what could be promised and delivered. By the autumn of 1941, diplomatic channels had produced a protocol, represented in diplomatic records, setting ambitious monthly targets for deliveries, including aircraft and tanks. An Oct 1 agreement discussed targets such as several hundred aircraft and hundreds of tanks per month, figures that sounded hopeful in memoranda, but would meet the practical limits of ship capacity, factory schedules, and the hazards of wartime transport. Into this web of politics and production stepped Averell Harriman, the U.S. envoy to Moscow. Harriman's mission was not merely technical. He was the man who translated American production numbers into Soviet lifelines, and he carried back notes of conversations that reveal how Stalin viewed the aid. According to Harriman's records and later diplomatic accounts, Stalin accepted aid with a blend of cold calculation and private discomfort. He asked pragmatic questions about continuation and volume. He also showed less eagerness to parade gratitude. One encounter, as recorded by Harriman, includes a chillingly practical question reportedly put by Stalin. If Moscow were to fall, would the delivery stop? The question, blunt and unforgiving, exposed a leader who measured alliances in contingencies and survival plans rather than in rhetoric. But promises on paper and envoys in the Kremlin did not convert instantly into armored columns on Moscow streets. To reach the Soviet heartland, Allied equipment had to cross some of the most hazardous supply routes of the war. There were three main arteries: the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangels, Pacific shipments to Vladivostok that relied on Soviet rail for westward transit, and the Persian corridor through Iran into the Caucasus. Each route carried its own perils. The Arctic route was a gamble with nature and with enemy submarines and aircraft. Convoys from the North Atlantic steamed into seas that iced over in winter and were patrolled by German U-boats and long-range aircraft based in occupied Norway. Ships arrived under blackout, often damaged, sometimes never reaching port. The Pacific route, by contrast, avoided the U-boat menace but required transfer of cargo across thousands of kilometers of Soviet rail, a network strained by war, overused, and in many places destroyed or converted for military traffic. The Persian corridor demanded political negotiation. Neutral Iran had to be secured and transit rights established, and then the physical task of moving enormous tonnages through deserts and over mountains to reach the Soviet rear. Each route could bring only so much at a time. Winter weather, enemy action, port capacity, and rail bottlenecks all limited throughput. To deliver tanks in quantity was to accept months of delay and a procession of logistical risks. The earliest deliveries that reached Soviet ports in the autumn of 1941 were small in number but outsized in symbolic meaning. In November and early December, crates and disassembled vehicles started to arrive, and mechanized units began to assemble them. Then, in mid-December, the first American-built tanks, designated for the USSR, mainly variants of the M3 family, appeared in Moscow. The M3 Stuart was the smaller of the two, a light tank, quick and maneuverable, armed typically with a 37mm gun and machine guns. Soviet crews noticed its speed and its mechanical reliability in some conditions. They nicknamed it variously in memoirs. According to a number of Soviet accounts, the Stuart came to be known affectionately, sometimes as the little brother, a testament to the way its modest capabilities nevertheless served tactical needs in reconnaissance and infantry support. The M3 Lee, by contrast, looked ungainly to Soviet eyes. Its most conspicuous feature was a 75mm gun mounted low in a sponson on the hull side, not in a conventional rotating turret. Above it sat a smaller turret with a 37mm gun and machine guns. The Lee's profile was tall and awkward. Riveted armor and a gasoline engine gave it traits that Soviet crews found both odd and less than ideal. Yet, the 75mm gun provided a credible punch against German fielded vehicles of late 1941, and the mechanical reliability in some theaters meant that Lees could be used where heavier Soviet tanks were unavailable. A few weeks later, the M4 Sherman would begin to arrive in greater numbers. Shermans were more balanced, a central turret, a 75mm gun, better ease of maintenance, and later iterations with improved armor and firepower. In the months after December 1941, the Sherman became the Lend-Lease tank that Western narratives would more readily celebrate. Soviet assessments were more mixed. Some crews admired the Sherman's mechanical steadiness and reliability of spare parts, while others preferred the T-34's sloped armor and powerful 76.2mm gun. What mattered to Soviet commanders was not purity of design, but whether a machine could be repaired quickly, supplied with fuel and ammunition, and kept moving on an overburdened logistical system. To understand how these machines were received on the ground, consider the account of Lieutenant Dmitry Loza, a Soviet tank commander whose memoirs provide a rare close-up of a frontline inspection. According to Loza's recollections, when he first climbed into an M3 in bitter cold, he noticed radios installed in each vehicle, a feature not universally present in Soviet tanks at the time, and a cramped but orderly interior. The American engines, Loza recorded, could be coaxed to turn over in extreme cold, whether by preheaters or by the mechanics who knew how to nurse them. Crew comfort was limited, so were most tank interiors, but operational features such as standardized tools and maintenance kits made a difference when a column broke down on a frozen road. These practical advantages, small and procedural, translated into longer-range mobility and fewer traffic-stopping repairs. Inspection of the first tanks in Moscow was therefore a sensory affair. The smell of hot metal, the hiss of cooling systems, the smoke of cigarette ash in officers' rooms as Soviet commanders and American diplomats compared notes. Engineers and mechanics traded language, broken grammar replaced by gestures and technical diagrams. Soviet mechanics demonstrated how to remove a stuck track link. American shore crews explained lubrication procedures. Those scenes were as much about technology as they were about the meeting of different military cultures. Back in the diplomatic sphere, the arrival of American tanks in Moscow provoked a series of readings, public and private. Official Soviet messaging framed the deliveries as international solidarity against fascism, emphasizing fraternal bonds and mutual struggle. Public parades that featured foreign material were staged to show unity. Yet diplomatic notes and private recollections recorded different texture of feeling. Harriman's dispatches and later accounts by himself and others suggest that Stalin's face in private councils was not one of open gratitude, but of measured acceptance. He wanted to know how much, how fast, and what next. One exchange that appears in Harriman's notes, reported rather than verbatim, captures the tension. Stalin, it is recorded, asked whether deliveries would continue even in the event of a catastrophe such as the fall of Moscow. The question was not rhetorical. It was an operational query about continuity and contingency. It also suggested a leader who was conscious of the political costs of dependence. Publicly, the Soviet Union would emphasize its own capacity and the heroism of its people. Privately, the Kremlin had to reckon with the fact that survival required foreign supplies. Tank crews added the most practical assessments. For many of them, the question was simple. Did the American tank keep them alive on the morning after a bad night? According to multiple frontline memoirs and military reports, the answer was often yes. Radios allowed better coordination. Spare parts kits and standardized wrench sets reduced time in the field. A reliable engine could mean the difference between escaping an advancing enemy and being encircled. At the same time, Soviet crews complained about logistical incompatibilities, different ammunition types, English language manuals, and the need for convoy mechanics trained to American machinery. The result was an improvisational period of adaptation, cannibalizing parts, translating instructions, and sometimes rearming or refitting vehicles with Soviet radio sets or weaponry. All of this prompts a broader question. Were American tanks decisive? The script of history is complex. Lend-Lease provided critical support, trucks that kept armies mobile, food that fed soldiers and civilians, raw materials and locomotives that sustained factories and rail networks. Tanks mattered, but they were part of a larger material ecosystem that made an industrial war possible. To single out tanks as the fulcrum of victory would misread the war. Yet to minimize their contribution would be equally wrong. According to the archival figures referenced in diplomatic and military records used for this account, the United States supplied the USSR with thousands of vehicles of various types over the course of the war. Numbers that grew from modest first shipments in late 1941 to far larger flows by 1943 and 1944. For tanks specifically, the transcript's figures indicate several thousand Shermans arriving later in the war, coupled with more than 1,000 M3 Lees and around 2,000 M3 Stuarts shipped in the early waves. These numbers, while only one part of a much larger material transfer, are significant for frontline units that needed mobility and firepower in particular sectors. The practical effect of Lend-Lease tanks varied by theater and by time. In some sectors, Soviet homegrown designs like the T-34 remained the backbone of armored forces. Their sloped armor and wide tracks gave them advantages in many combat situations. In other situations, rear area security, reconnaissance, or units that suffered catastrophic losses and needed immediate replacements, American tanks filled critical gaps. Shermans, for example, were more easily repaired in some contexts and benefited from standardized logistics when American technicians were available to assist. Lees, despite their awkward design, offered a 75mm gun that could be decisive against softer targets. Stuarts, light and nimble, performed roles that larger tanks could not. There is, too, a symbolic dimension that is hard to quantify. The image of American armor rolling through Moscow struck both domestic and international observers. For Soviet propaganda, it had to be assimilated into a narrative of international anti-fascist unity without conceding ideological indebtedness. For foreign observers and for the soldiers who rode in those machines, the sight carried practical reassurance. The Allies were not isolated. Goods were flowing despite Germany's attempt to close off supply corridors. For Stalin, the spectacle presented an awkward glory. He accepted the help because he had to. He also resented the implication that Soviet independence was compromised by necessity. That ambivalence shows up in the recorded reactions of various contemporaries. Some Soviet officials, keen to preserve national pride, stressed the independence of the Soviet war effort while quietly accepting shipments. Harriman and other diplomats recorded moments of frankness and of calculation. Stalin's questions about continuity of aid, his insistence that help be material and effective rather than ceremonial. Tank crews and veterans later remembered the steel and the spare parts more readily than the political rhetoric. That ambivalence shows up in the recorded reactions of various contemporaries. Some Soviet officials, keen to preserve national pride, stressed the independence of the Soviet war effort while quietly accepting shipments. Harriman and other diplomats recorded moments of frankness and of calculation. Stalin's questions about continuity of aid, his insistence that help be material and effective rather than ceremonial. Tank crews and veterans later remembered the steel and the spare parts more readily than the political rhetoric. In oral histories conducted after the war, veterans recalled specific instances where a Lend-Lease truck pulled a regiment out of a mud season, or where an American engine kept a tank rolling through a night of retreat. Those memories shaped a kind of subterranean gratitude that rarely surfaced in official histories until much later. As deliveries increased through 1942 and into 1943, the character of Lend-Lease changed. Numbers rose, factories in the United States moved into full wartime production, and logistical expertise improved. The Persian Corridor, developed and expanded through Allied coordination, became a more reliable route. Arctic convoys persisted, but with heavy losses, illustrating the price paid to keep supplies flowing. Meanwhile, the integration of American machinery into Soviet formations drove tactical innovation and improvisation. Soviet repair units staffed by men trained in American equipment became a kind of laboratory for cross-cultural technical adaptation. Parts were re-engineered. Ammunition storage practices were adapted to different calibers. Field expedients were devised to use available materials in unconventional ways. The Sherman, arriving in larger numbers by 1943, contributed in particular ways. According to the transcripts compiled records, roughly 3,000 Shermans were sent to the USSR, figures that require archival verification but that indicate a non-trivial influx. Complementing that were the earlier shipments of M3 Lees, numbering over 1,000 in some records and around 2,000 M3 Stuarts in the early waves. Those numbers tell us two things. First, the Lend-Lease program was not a single traumatic theatrical gesture, but a prolonged, cumulative effort. Second, the material delivered was diverse, suited to many roles across fronts and seasons. It is worth remembering that tanks do not win wars by themselves. The trucks that moved supplies to front lines, the rails that carried ammunition and men, the food that fed armies and civilians, all these contributions matter immensely. Some historians estimating the relative impact of Lend-Lease emphasize that American trucks alone may have done more to increase Soviet mobility than any single class of tanks. Locomotives and raw materials kept Soviet factories turning. Airframes and engines made a difference. In operational terms, the combination of domestic Soviet production, Allied material aid, and sheer human sacrifice produced the conditions in which large-scale offensives could be planned and executed. Returning to December 19, 1941, the image of those American tanks moving through Moscow crystallizes all these layers. A public symbol of an international alliance, a private acknowledgement of dependence under duress, and a practical inflection point in a long logistical chain. For Stalin, the sight required a political stance. He accepted supplies, but remained keenly aware of the power dynamics such acceptance implied. For Soviet propaganda, the tanks had to be converted into a narrative of solidarity and heroic resistance. For soldiers, mechanics, and ordinary citizens, the tanks were a tangible promise that the industrial might of the United States could be focused, however belatedly, on preserving Soviet capacity. The historical record resists easy moralization. Different sources tell complementary but sometimes conflicting stories. Official Soviet records underline the centrality of Soviet sacrifice and production. Diplomatic notebooks and envoys' memoirs reveal transactional realism and moments of frank calculation. Tank crews' memoirs and technical reports provide the granular, often messy reality of field adaptation. That patchwork is precisely the point. The encounter between Stalin and that first column of American tanks was not a single, unambiguous event, but a juncture where ideology, necessity, international politics, and human experience intersected. What then happened when Stalin encountered his first American tank arrival? Something practical and something symbolic. Practically, materials arrived that could be repaired, used, and integrated into a wartime economy strained to the breaking point. Radios and spare parts improved communications and maintenance. Extra guns and engines supplemented a depleted inventory. Symbolically, foreign armor moving through Red Square was a visible admission that the Soviet Union required supplies from a world it had long viewed with suspicion. An admission that shaped Stalin's policies and the Soviet narrative for decades to come. That image of steel in the snow also left a different legacy. A memory among veterans and technocrats that transcended propagandistic silence. Years after the war, some remembered the American trucks that kept their divisions mobile, the engines that started when Soviet vehicles failed, and the tools that let them keep fighting. Official historiography, cautious of acknowledging foreign assistance in a narrative of self-reliance, downplayed these contributions when it suited political ends. Yet oral histories and private notes preserved a countercurrent of practical appreciation. Looking back from the vantage of history, we should avoid two mistakes. One is to treat Lend-Lease or American tanks alone as the single cause of Soviet victory. An overreach that ignores scale, Soviet industrial recovery, strategic depth, and the sheer human cost and determination on the Eastern Front. The other mistake is to diminish the tangible effects material aid had on operations and survival. Lend-Lease shortened timelines, alleviated logistical bottlenecks, and in some cases directly preserved units that might otherwise have been lost. It was significant without being omnipotent. Finally, the scene in the Kremlin returns to us not as a simple tableau of gratitude or shame, but as a study in contradictions. Stalin's face at that window likely contained more calculation than emoting. The leader who engineered mass mobilizations and purges also negotiated in the language of supply chains. The soldier who climbed into a Stuart in -40°C, according to Loza and others, was less concerned with doctrine than with whether he could reach the next village alive. The diplomat in Harriman's notes recorded questions that hinted at contingency plans for catastrophe. All these perspectives are true in their domains. The American tanks that rolled through Moscow in December 1941 were, therefore, both engine and emblem. Engines that sometimes performed better than expected in cold, and emblematic instruments that announced a new reality. That survival in a total war sometimes required setting aside pure ideology for the blunt arithmetic of industry and logistics. The story of those tanks is not the story of a single decisive intervention. It is the story of how the war was won at the intersection of steel, supply, strategy, and stubborn human adaptation. If this exploration has piqued your interest in the material and human side of World War II logistics, subscribe and turn on notifications to catch the next deep dive, where we follow an Arctic convoy from departure to Murmansk and trace what it cost to keep that northern artery open. The tanks eventually faded from the front pages, replaced by newer models and by Soviet industrial recovery. But the memory of them, of rivets in the snow, radios clicking on frozen mornings, and mechanics leaning over hoods, remained with the men who used them. In official records, the Soviet narrative would emphasize victory as a product of Soviet genius and sacrifice. In private notebooks and veterans' recollections, the machines that arrived from afar are remembered as practical gifts that, combined with Soviet industry and will, kept the engines of resistance turning. That winter in Moscow, when a column of American tanks rolled through a capital under threat, the world saw an image that was at once shocking and inevitable. It revealed a leader calculating outcomes, soldiers adapting machinery, diplomats negotiating continuities, and a nation accepting that survival sometimes requires borrowing strength. The steel on the streets was not merely foreign metal. It was a physical manifestation of a hard truth of war. Ideology bowed, briefly and quietly, to necessity.